The letter to the Philippians, or the epistle to the Philippians, epistle just means letter, was written by the Apostle Paul. It was written sometime in the early 50s AD. This was one of Paul's earliest letters to the churches. And so it's a letter to the church that was in a city called Philippi. Philippi was an important city for the Empire of Rome. And it was a place where there was a lot of trade. It was a place where Roman military veterans, retired citizens of Rome. So it was a place where Paul, in Acts chapter 16, as he was making a second missionary journey to visit all of the churches that they had started on his first missionary journey, he was on a journey with Silas, and they stopped in Laodicea and they picked up Timothy to go with them. And then when they got to Troas, as they got to Troas, Paul got a vision of a man from Macedonia, and the man was saying, "Come and help us." And so what they did is they got on a ship and they went up to into the area of Macedonia. They landed in a port called Neapolis, and they got off the ship and they traveled north. They went up to a city about 10 miles inland called Philippi. When they got to Philippi, they looked around for the local synagogue, but there weren't a lot of Jews in Philippi at the time. And so when there wasn't enough Jews to make a synagogue in a city, they would meet down by the river. The Jews would meet down by the river, and that's where they would practice their religion. So Paul went to the river, and he found a group of women who were Jews in the area, and they were worshiping the Lord there. And so Paul, as he always did when he would go into all the cities that he would go into, he would first go to the Jews. He said the gospel is for the Jew first and also for the Greek. And so he'd always give his own people the chance to hear the gospel first, and depending on how they responded, he would then later go to the Greeks. And so he went to the Jews. He told a woman named Lydia and the other women that were there the gospel, and they believed. And so Lydia invited him to come to her house and stay, which was just hospitality. The people in that time practiced hospitality. When you're traveling through, there were no hotels, and so you would stay with the local people that were there. And so she invited them to come to her home and stay there. And while they were there, he continued to teach and preach the gospel to the people that were there. Some other people that were there in Philippi stirred up the people against them. And long story short, Paul and Silas ended up in prison. So while they were in prison there, God did some amazing things. He shook the prison. A great earthquake took place. All the cells of the prison doors were opened. And as the jailer, because he was responsible for keeping all the prisoners, woke up to the earthquake, saw that all the prison doors would open, and assumed that all the prisoners had escaped. And so he was getting ready to kill himself, because basically, under Roman law, if you were in charge of keeping a prisoner and you allowed that prisoner to escape, whatever the penalty that would have come to the prisoner, whatever that penalty that was supposed to be meted out on the prisoner, you would pay that penalty instead. And so there was probably some pretty bad characters in there. And so he's assuming, well, the prisoners all escaped, so it's better just to take my own life than to face whatever judgment the Roman government's going to give me. And so he was getting ready to kill himself, and Paul cries out and he says, "Don't harm yourself, we're all here." And so the jailer, obviously thinking he's about to die, he's all shaken up, and he goes to Paul. He knows what Paul and Silas have been preaching, and so he says, "Sirs, what must I do to believe?" And so he cleans up their wounds, because Paul and them have been beaten by the local authorities and thrown into prison. So he takes them to his own home, cleans up their wounds, gives them something to eat, and then Paul shares the gospel with the whole family, and the whole family gets saved. So anyway, that's a story in the book of Acts chapter 16, and it goes into 17. Anyways, so that's how the church in Philippi was started. Paul spends a little bit more time there. He ends up leaving. Then later on, he passes through Philippi as well. Timothy is very familiar with them because he was there with Paul and Silas when the church in Philippi was started. And so Philippi has continued to be a church that loves Paul and supports him on his missionary journey. So they've sent several gifts to him over the years to support him in his missionary journeys. And now in the book of Acts, later in Acts, we can read how Paul has, at this point in his life, he's been betrayed by the Jews that were in Jerusalem. He was in prison under this guy named Felix for a couple of years in that area of Palestine. And so now, because he wasn't getting justice there, he has appealed to, as a Roman citizen, for his right to have his case reviewed by Caesar himself. And so now that whole process is documented in Acts, how he gets taken on a ship and eventually he gets to Rome. So Philippi is written from Rome. Now the Philippians had heard at some point that Paul was being taken to Rome as a prisoner to have his case heard before the emperor. And so they have sent already a gift to Paul. So they sent that gift by a guy named Epaphroditus. Epaphroditus, on his journey to see Paul and bring the gift that the Philippians had given him, he falls like deathly ill and he almost dies. So the Philippians hear about what's happened. Epaphras somehow makes his way or gets taken to Rome, and he's nursed back to health while he's there. And so Paul is now writing this letter to the church in Philippi to tell them about how Epaphroditus is doing, to assure them that everything's okay. He received the gift that they sent. He wants them to be encouraged. He knows that they're probably facing persecution like all the other churches are. Some of the heresies that have reached the other church probably haven't reached Philippi by this time, because Philippi is in a different area. It's called Macedonia, not in Galatia, where the other churches are. And so he's writing a letter to them to encourage them in their faith, to encourage them that Epaphroditus is doing good, to encourage them that even though he's in chains, God's using his imprisonment for his own purposes, that the household of Caesar is being saved, that the Roman Praetorian Guard is being saved, the ones who are actually chained to Paul in shifts during the day. Paul sees them as the perfect audience to preach the gospel to, so they're getting saved. And he's telling them basically he's going to be sending Epaphroditus to them. They were asking that he would send Timothy to them as well, but he's saying, I need Timothy a little while longer. He's the only one here that really understands, me and has the same heart for the Lord as I do. So I need him here a little bit longer. He's telling them that eventually he hopes to come and visit them as well when he's released from his imprisonment, which in church history, eventually that does actually happen. He does get released. But so that's what the letter to the Philippians is about. So as we get into it, that's the background of the letter to the Philippians. Paul sending a letter to them to encourage them in their faith, to encourage them to keep standing strong despite whatever persecution may be happening, to keep standing strong despite the fact that he's in prison. Paul's being a good witness and an example to them in his own imprisonment, his own suffering, that he's trying to get them to see the bigger picture, that really, although, yeah, he's got suffering in this life, suffering in his flesh, suffering in his imprisonment, and yet the bigger picture is God has a bigger purpose and plan in the midst of all of his suffering, and that he is using it and he's going to continue to use it, and that even if the worst should happen, when he finally does get his audience before Caesar, if Caesar orders him to be executed, that even in that, God can use his death for his purposes, to spread his gospel into all the world. So he's going to have an audience before Caesar soon, and he's asking them to pray for him, that he would have strength and boldness in the gospel, and that God would give him the words to say as he shares the gospel of everlasting life with the emperor of the greatest empire the world has ever seen. So that's the summary, the grand overview of Philippians.